I hate when unattractive, darker skinned women, when they get rejected, they automatically assume it's because they're dark skinned and they call the man who's rejecting them a colorist. It's like, no, there's some beautiful dark skinned women out here. You're just not one of them. It's not because you're dark skinned, it's because I don't find you attractive. I never hear unattractive light skinned women, unattractive white women, and unattractive brown skinned women say, it's because I'm brown skinned, it's because I'm light skinned, it's because I'm white. They never say that when they get rejected. Sometimes they either call you gay or take it on the chin. I'd rather a dark-skinned woman, when she get rejected, call the man gay before she calls him a colorist.
Okay, I can't be the only one. I just got off the phone with my mom, and this is after 10 years of not talking. We're like just now FaceTiming here and there. And all she can tell me on the phone is different home remedies to lighten my skin or lighten the color of my lips and make them pink or lighten my eye color. Like everything is to make me look lighter. And honestly, at one point, I got so angry and just lost it because this is ridiculous. It's 2023 and I'm not a kid anymore. And I used to cry about it as a kid.
Americans, non-Americans, people of melanin complexion, people of color, whether you are African descent, whether you are Asian descent, whether you are Indian descent, meaning from India, whether you're indigenous descent, Mexican descent, wherever. I want to talk about colorism because it is really real. Colorism is having the impression that the lighter your skin is, the better you are. And many people in the backgrounds, the ethnic backgrounds that I just mentioned, are dealing with the effects of colorism, even in their own ethnicities, even in their own families. Whereas though, if you were born of a lighter complexion than the rest of the people in your family or in your community, you're better and you're treated better. And this is absolutely demonic and toxic. And the enemy is alive and well in these spaces. So if you've ever had to deal with colorism, whereas though maybe a grandmother preferred you over another grandchild because you were more fair complected, or maybe you were able to pass because you were of a lighter skin tone, I want to let you know that that is not God, okay? And this spirit is running rampant in our world, okay? And people are being poorly treated based off of this ignorant mentality that the devil uses to divide. If you are a Christian and you practice this kind of mindset, I challenge you to take it to the Lord in prayer, because everything God made is good. And if God made Filipinos, if he made black people, if he made Thai people, if he made Indian people, indigenous people, if he made Mexican people, people from the Caribbean, if God made them, how can there be any fault in that? I don't get it. And so what has been happening in our world is that the more lighter complected you are, the more better you are. And it's absolutely false. And if we can get outside of this mindset, if you have people in your family that are practicing this mentality, you need to check them. You need to correct them, because they're absolutely working with Satan in this regard. And I'm telling you this because this has divided so many people, even people in the church.
Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today centers on, well, one of the most painful and complex issues highlighted in reflections on Fonda E. Woodard's memoir, Never Said a Word: The Persistent Presence and, frankly, the Power of Colorism. The source material really forces us to grapple with how prejudice operates based on skin shade, often crucially within the same racial and ethnic groups. So the central question we need to confront is this: is colorism merely the internal manifestation of external racial oppression, what we often term, internalized racism, or does its unique function, acting almost exclusively within the community, make it structurally and functionally distinct from the external system of racism? I'll be arguing the position that colorism is fundamentally internalized racism. It's derived entirely, I believe, from the system of white supremacy. It is the direct cost of that conditioning.
And I see why you'd frame it that way, but I approach it from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely agree that colorism shares the same poisonous roots, colonialism, white supremacy, no question there, I argue that colorism is functionally distinct. We really have to acknowledge that the location of the harm, the fact that it acts inside the community, well, it changes its mechanism and requires, I think, a separate conceptual framework to really address the specific wounds it creates.
Okay, so my position really rests on this idea that colorism serves as the primary mechanism through which external oppression rooted, as we've said, in centuries of colonialism and white supremacy, is absorbed and then replicated within oppressed communities. The external system, it established whiteness as the standard, right? For beauty, intelligence, worth. Colorism is, in my view, merely the direct consequence of accepting that imposed structure. When Woodard describes the suffering she endured as the darkest-skinned member of her light-skinned family, that emotional and psychological toll, that feeling of being too dark to be fully accepted or loved, that is the direct emotional cost of having absorbed that external racial hierarchy. So to try and pull colorism away from the broader umbrella of racial oppression, well, it risks obscuring its origin. It isn't just similar to racism, it is the internalized face of racism.
That's a critical perspective, certainly. But I would argue that even if the origin is shared, the function ultimately changes the nature of the phenomenon. And the material itself, I think, provides a clear basis for this distinction. It notes, and I'm quoting roughly here, that racism usually comes from outside the community while colorism comes from within. That location, that internal aspect, that's defining. Racism, it oppresses externally. It dictates housing, employment, political power, these large structural things. Colorism, though, it operates differently. The source says it slowly erodes from the inside, targeting self-esteem, family unity, intrinsic worth, all based on shade. And this internal pressure, it often results in what the source terms a really tragic survival strategy. Think about that for a second. In some contexts, lightness becomes a perceived mechanism for safety, maybe, or upward mobility within the oppressed group itself. That internal drive, which generates these devastating social costs like broken families and an inheritance of shame, well, it needs to be treated as its own distinct system of prejudice if we really hope to dismantle it effectively.
Okay. Let's focus then on the significance of this internal versus external dynamic, because I agree that seems to be the core point of tension here. You're emphasizing the location of the trauma.
Exactly. I argue that the internal nature of colorism is its defining feature. It's a system of prejudice wielded against members of the same racial or ethnic group. Woodard's experience is so powerful, I think, precisely because she faced this prejudice not primarily from, say, a white power structure in that instance, but from her own family. That specific internalized mechanism, that feeling of being almost betrayed by those closest to you, it generates a unique emotional trauma. This trauma, targeting the subtle structures of belonging and love within a family, within a community, it demands its own conceptual framework. It feels separate from the framework we use when we discuss structural discrimination coming from the state or, external institutions,
so to speak. That internal manifestation, whether it's coming from a parent or a peer, it doesn't, for me, change the fundamental nature of the prejudice itself. The standard being applied consistently is proximity to whiteness. That criteria was set by external racism. It wasn't invented internally. So whether the gatekeeper applying that standard is outside the community or inside it, they are both referencing the exact same valuation structure. Look at that really poignant detail in the material about Woodard picking a vanilla ice cream cone. It's presented as this almost reflexive desire for lightness, tied to a deep, agonizing need for acceptance. That need is entirely defined by external white standards of beauty and value. The internal action, however painful, is simply a function of replicating the externally imposed structure. We end up, doing the system's dirty work for it, essentially.
But isn't the mechanism of replication itself the distinction that matters for intervention? You described that internal erosion earlier. When the source notes that colorism slowly erodes from the inside, it's speaking to a specific form of psychic violence. It happens when the victim is constantly confronted by prejudice from sources, family members, peers, who crucially share their own racial background. External racism is generally understood as an act of power imbalance between groups. Colorism, though, it feels more like an act of self-mutilation or at least hierarchical enforcement within the oppressed group. This internal hierarchy gets enforced through, well, often unspoken beauty standards, who receives favor, who's seen as a desirable partner. This requires a separate lens, I maintain, to understand the unique harm of feeling lesser, even in your own home, in your own community. If we only call it internalized racism, we risk constantly referring back to the external aggressor instead of confronting the hierarchy that, tragically, we ourselves have sometimes built and maintained.
I'm still not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because it feels like it elevates the symptom over the foundational disease. I stand by the idea that colorism is fundamentally a symptom of a deeper, structural condition, racism rooted in colonialism and white supremacy. It represents the high and frankly unnecessary emotional cost of centuries of conditioning that taught us to measure worth by proximity to whiteness. So if we focus all our energy on treating this internal prejudice as a wholly separate structure, we risk, I think, divorcing it from its structural origin. And this potentially creates a conceptual loophole where we might inadvertently end up blaming the community for the prejudice rather than placing the culpability squarely on the external system that supplied the initial poisonous criteria for division.
The focus for me must remain on challenging the root cause, that valuation hierarchy, or the internal prejudice will just continue to multiply, generation after generation.
I absolutely appreciate the focus on the root cause. It's vital. But isn't that perspective potentially neglecting the immediate and often self-perpetuating nature of the internal trauma? A symptom, maybe, but when it develops its own self-sustaining feedback loops, it starts to function as its own system of oppression, doesn't it? Experts might reasonably categorize it separately precisely because of its unique and devastating internal consequences. The source material points directly to the specific devastation of colorism, the profound fractured self-esteem, the internalized erosion of worth. This specific kind of harm demands immediate, targeted awareness. We have to focus on addressing the mechanisms within the community, calling out the subtle, maybe even unintentional, shade jokes, actively re-examining beauty standards, having those incredibly difficult conversations at kitchen tables. We can, and I believe we must, fight external racism while simultaneously fighting the internal mechanism that perpetuates shame within families across generations. The unique nature of the inheritance of shame, as the source calls it, requires specific intervention that maybe goes beyond just challenging colonialism in the abstract.
Okay, let's unpack that concept, the inheritance of shame, a bit more. When you argue that colorism functions as a separate system, what practical difference does that make when we start discussing intervention or healing?
Well, I think it fundamentally changes the starting point for healing. If we view it solely as internalized racism, the solution seems purely structural. Fight the external system, dismantle white supremacy, and eventually the internal problem will dissipate. But if we view it as a self-perpetuating, distinct system operating now internally, we must begin with internal relational healing as well. The inheritance of shame means that the very same survival strategies like favoring lighter skin that maybe a grandparent adopted to cope with blatant racism are then unconsciously passed down, fracturing families in the present. Recognizing that means we must focus our awareness on calling out these biases within ourselves, within our families, right now, rather than just waiting for the external structure to fully collapse. It becomes an immediate, practical necessity for internal peace and family cohesion.
But if we accept that the criteria for colorism are entirely dictated by external white supremacy, and I really believe the evidence supports that, then the truest path forward, the most fundamental one, requires confronting those historical roots head-on. Healing in that sense must focus on understanding who taught us to see ourselves as less, and actively, consciously unlearning those centuries of external conditioning. The true release from colorism, I believe, comes from dismantling the racial hierarchy that gave lighter skin its initial, unearned value in the first place. If we don't keep our focus on that structural awareness, we risk suggesting that the solution lies simply in individuals having, better self-esteem, which kind of ignores the immense systemic pressure they're under. The fight against colorism is fundamentally, for me, the fight against the enduring logic of colonialism.
And while that structural awareness is absolutely vital, I have to come back to the immediate path to healing. As demonstrated by Woodard's reclaiming of her story, her voice, her worth, it seems to require addressing the internal pain directly. Healing begins, practically speaking, with the awareness of the specific internalized pain carried and the necessity, as the source puts it, of speaking the truths we were taught to silence. Think about the distinction in the labor required, too. Fighting external structural racism involves things like policy change, public advocacy, challenging institutions. The labor required to fight colorism often involves confronting deeply ingrained silent family dynamics, correcting internalized self-hatred, and engaging in the really difficult, often painful process of recognizing and dismantling prejudice against darker skin tones within one's own group. That feels like a distinct, agonizing, and deeply relational labor.
It complements certainly, but it's not identical to fighting external structural racism. That specific pain, I feel, needs its own name and its own framework.
Ultimately, I still maintain that it is conceptually crucial to always maintain the link between colorism and its original cause. Colorism is fundamentally the secondary wound, if you will, derived from the primary systemic wound of racism. It's the product, undeniably, of centuries of colonialism and white supremacy. To effectively dismantle the preference for lighter skin, we must keep the pressure on the original cause, the system that invented the hierarchy in the first place.
And I would reiterate the importance, from my perspective, of acknowledging the functional and structural distinctions of colorism. The prejudice operating internally, from family, from peers, is critical for recognizing the specific trauma, that inheritance of shame, and the destructive survival strategies experienced by those like Woodard. By acknowledging colorism as a distinct system of harm operating right now, we ensure that the specific, unique pain caused by prejudice from within one's own community is never overlooked or minimized in our efforts to heal.
Well, this discussion certainly illuminates the profound complexity of the issue. Whether one views colorism primarily as an internalized system stemming from racism or as a distinct structural entity with its own internal mechanisms, it clearly shares undeniable poisonous origins with external racism.
Indeed. And perhaps the value lies precisely therein, acknowledging both the shared soil, that foundation of white supremacy, and also the distinct internal mechanisms of harm. Only by understanding both the deep roots and the internal feedback loops can we hope to ensure that every form of this devastating prejudice is fully understood and aggressively challenged, regardless of exactly where it manifests.
Quick story time. I meet a dude online, y'all. He's a colorist, but he's black. He's a black colorist, and he's dark skinned. Sister dark, mama dark. He thinks this my real hair. First thing he asks is, "Oh my God, what are you mixed with?" Girl, I'm such a liar. I'm such a liar. Girl, I've been listening to Young Scooter, so I told him I'm Colombian. Y'all should go listen to that. It's a really good song, by the way. It's called Young Scooter. Girl, Colombia by Young Scooter, girl. Listen, that's neither here nor there. The nigga thinks I'm Colombian. I don't know nothing about them folks. So, girl, I'm just lying. He just asked me all types of stuff about my heritage. So, girl, we go on a date last night. I know what I'm doing. Because, girl, the restaurant was dark. So, mind y'all, girl, sister, you know what that look like to you. Do that look Peruvian? Do them roots look Peruvian to you, sister? I didn't think so. But, girl, he's so freaking color struck. Girl, he over there like, oh, my God, your hair is amazing. It's so long and just, wow, it's so healthy. So what should we do, sisters? Because I love to break a colorist's heart. So I'm thinking Boosie fade next date. Girl, I love my 5Z afro. Because apparently everybody got 4C hair now. So what I'm thinking of a little Boosie temp, Caesar cut, have his babies. And then everybody in my family black. He come to the cookout and you ain't gonna see no Salvadorians. You gonna see none but nickels.
Bro, I took 2 swipes and I'm back talking again, bro. Why y'all niggas colorists? I don't like being light-skinned. I don't like light skins. I love me a dark berry. I love that. Y'all never heard that saying of dirty light skin, the nasty light skin? I'm in that era when being light skinned was actually a bad thing. Like, you were generally disgusting. Like, only light skins could have been dirty back then.